Hello everyone, my name is Ruth Nordstrom. I'm the studio manager at SUHO, and today I'm going to be talking about a topic that I have stumbled across in the last couple of years in my endeavours. A little bit on my background. I've just finished doing a little bit of study in secondary education with teaching placements that took me about 6 years to do because I was having kids in between, so it's a very long time coming. I also have been working at SUHO for quite a number of years, in particular on the 10-star house and a number of other projects which are energy efficient as well. I would also like to invite anyone that's needing CPD points to also email us using these steps because you can get a Green Star Sustainable Development CPD point. So just let us know that you're here during the chat, ask any questions if you have them, and I'll endeavour to answer them to the best of my ability, and then also just say goodbye at the end, and then we can provide you with that. So my journey, as I said, I've got a background in education. I was teaching at universities and in secondary schools during my studies. I have been working in the architecture and building design industry since graduating almost a decade ago, but really wanted to focus my learnings and my career development in sustainable design, hence working for SUHO. Because we do things a little bit differently. And this difference in discipline has actually led me to find overlaps between them, which has been really interesting. And I stumbled across an article which kind of stemmed the thought for this webinar. If you Google The Economist and this title, it will come up, The Rise of Buildings for the Deaf and Blind. What it was talking about is that quite often people have sensory issues, and the buildings and the way that we design them at the moment isn't necessarily inclusive for those people. Now they can be just a short-term deficit, so say like hearing loss temporarily or something like that, but it does mean that we're making it very difficult in terms of safety for these people to get through and be included in society in the way that they really should be, that they have the right to be. In working in education, I started learning about dual sensory issues. Often they are coupled, which is something that I didn't know. I just sort of assumed that if someone was blind, they may not have other issues. Learning about that was particularly important because a lot of the information that I gained was actually about Indigenous communities, and quite often learning about children and the way that they develop. Quite often young Indigenous children have something like a hearing impairment, might not be picked up quite so early as some other students of the same age, just because of the socio-economic differences between those two groups. And it is not really fair to these children to have that picked up later, and quite often when it's picked up too late, then we also find that there's other issues that come into play, such as these genetic depositions to having, say, eye disease or something like that. Quite often Indigenous children get eye infections. I've got 12 years as a registered and practicing optical dispenser as well in one of my many careers. So I've really found the overlap between all of these different areas and really finding a bit of a niche for myself, and I'm really quite passionate about this topic, which you'll find out. And it's something that really drives me as a sustainable designer to ensure that any student or any person in a situation where they're needing some sensory engagement are able to access that and do it in a much more sustainable way. And also as designers, we can provide that sustainable solution through some very, very simple things such as materials, which can also help. Touching on the visual communication and architecture side of things, I've also got a background in visual communications, and when I was doing architecture I really wanted to focus on bringing people through spaces. And one concept that I regularly use in a lot of my work is how do we visually communicate through difference in materials and different planes that are being used to direct someone to an end goal. Tying this back into this article from The Economist is quite interesting because even though someone might be without sight, there are ways that we can direct them through those spaces, and I've got a really good example at the end of this webinar, which I think hopefully you'll go look up, which is really interesting in terms of someone without sight and actually being able to journey someone through the space using environmental means. So it's very interesting. I also have 2 young children. One is in kindergarten, and also being in isolation and the home life of home office is very important to understand how these environments are actually affecting individuals as well. So that's enough about me. So in my education journey, I have stumbled across this book, which for me is the go-to book. I forget all these other parenting books. This one basically gives me everything that I need to know because it actually focuses on different methodologies of approaching learning with children based on their cognitive development. What I didn't know before doing the education degree and before teaching to, before speaking to my teachers during my pracs was actually what parts of the brains get switched on at what points. So we're not all born with abilities to think abstractly and so forth, and they sort of are implemented sequentially as the brain develops over a number of years up until we're, say, about 25. So it's very interesting, and I hope that you go source this book out because it's a really good reference even for a parent without education background, and for designers, if you are designing schools, it is also a very good source so that you can actually understand how the learning spaces should actually be arranged based on development. So in terms of child development, there can be things like difficulty speaking. When children are very, very young, so say up to the age of 2, they might use different parts of their environment to aid in their development. A lot of young children use their mouth to test out and get information of things. So if you're thinking about the environmental space that some of these children are in, it's really important to make them safe, make them low toxic environments that can actually be quite playful and adaptable as well. So students quite often also, up until a certain point, have a very egocentric view of the world, as if they're in their own little universe. And it's actually quite interesting, again, reading in this book, if you're looking back on the development of the brain and the way that babies attach to parents, it's not until they get to a certain age that they actually realise, oh, you know, myself is not me and my mum or me and my dad. Myself is this entity and I'm not part of this bigger picture. So it's actually quite interesting to go through this process. In terms of relating this cognitive development and learning spaces to sustainability and how as designers we should actually be rethinking the way that we're doing learning spaces, again I look at this example which I probably connected to the most in terms of my education study. And it breaks down in the different years how the brain changes and develops and what is actually required for that. And what I've done is go through and basically give a bit of a link to that also. So up until the age of 2, learning is using the 5 senses. So as we know, it's hearing, taste, or the mouth, vision, smell, touch. And if there's any of those senses that aren't active, and in my son, he was in that category, he had moderate hearing loss, it can actually be a very, very different environment to be in. You've got to support some of those deficits in sensory abilities by accommodating other senses, more or less. So in terms of using the 5 senses and the motor skills that they're developing at this age, if you're focusing on quiet areas to develop language, so say little pods where you're actually using materiality, lighting potentially, soft lighting, constant temperature and fresh air to limit germs, that's a very good way of supporting that learning. Coincidentally, a couple of days ago I actually got a email from my childcare saying that in accordance with the COVID-19 restrictions and recommendations for children within childcare, they are actually required to have some sleeping time outdoors because of the fresh air issues. So some of these buildings that children are in while we're at work generally are not probably as healthy as what they should be. And then that can also mean that the children are getting a little bit too much CO2 or something like that if it's a really active environment. And we need to address that through things like HRV systems, which we have put in the 10-star house, and I'll talk about a little bit later. Other sorts of technology that can actually freshen up that air, use circulation of air within the space, so limiting the amount of CO2, limiting the amount of off-gassing of materials, and also make that a much more engaging and enriching environment. Up until the age of 7, or between 3 and 7, the skills are required to represent the world, so it's very symbolic. The areas that they're learning in need to be very durable so that they can start creating and constructing symbols out of objects. I have a son in this category, and it is very, very true for him that he definitely needs some level of durability, as most parents of young boys would know. Also for his language development, because he had a slight hearing loss when he was born, and it took us a little while to get to the point where we could treat it. Developing his language even as a baby through that sensory period into this pre-operational period was very, very important. I also noticed from being in schools that the temperature inside of the room, if it got too hot, then it sort of instilled a little bit of anxiety in some children as well. So what we can do as designers is use things like thermal mass in these focused learning spaces, or around windows where they're getting daylighting, but it's controlled, to actually enhance these learning spaces a lot better. During the next period, the concrete operations, between 7 and 11 years, we need to allow a little bit more flexibility. So if you give a space where you can operate certain elements that can change between different lessons, and that's a really great way of maintaining engagement with students. I know, speaking to one of my mentor teachers through my education degree, and we tested it out in one lesson, setting up a classroom in one way for one lesson, and getting that engagement to working, and then the children coming in the next lesson and the room is completely switched around to a different direction, is a really good way of making those children re-engage with the topic, or extend out learning even. It could be the same content, or reflective learning for that lesson, but it makes them learn for longer. Things like using windows or line of sight as well can help. Material, air and lighting. In the next stage, when you get into teenage years, unfortunately, we get into the formal operations stage, so hence putting the brain this way, because we kind of know what teenagers go through. A lot of the development reasoning within this book explains that it's not necessarily that students and young children of this age are actually rebelling against things. Is that actually that they can't explain that level of emotion that they have. They are also trying to create a sense of identity which they haven't had before, because they have essentially followed a very logical sequence in terms of development and reasoning. Once they get to the formal operations stage, they really need to start acting out the world and creating this space and this identity for themselves. a lot of learning spaces, the typical row classrooms where you've got all the tables and chairs in a row looking directly at a teacher, doesn't necessarily give a sense of identity. I was in one classroom as well in Melbourne, and it actually did the opposite. So we had tables in a row, and there were some children that had some sensory and learning difficulties, and that configuration actually ended up isolating them even further because we couldn't control things like noise through the environment, lighting especially, and the ability to actually move and manipulate the orientation of where these desks were facing. So it's great for teachers to actually have spaces that are designed specifically for that adaptation to different scenarios. It'll help them engage the students much more, and the students will engage with the content and learn it a lot easier because it's immersive. And you can get the students involved in adapting the space, so it's even better. There are a lot of undiagnosed conditions which could actually be environmental. I've spoken a little bit in terms of indoor air quality, but that can also cause concentration issues as well. So we can all imagine, being in a room where all the windows, all the doors are shut, putting a whole heap of people in there, the humidity goes up inside, the CO2 probably goes up inside. There might be new materials inside the building that are giving off smell as well, giving off toxins. That can also affect the concentration for these children. Inclusive environments, I think, are important also in terms of environmental design, because if we have spaces where we have individuals that can't actually operate elements, they're not able to adapt that environment to their purpose. And I think it's really important as designers to actually make sure that we are making these spaces adaptable to these identities, or these little groups of identities if they're working in groups. So this diagram on the right essentially shows very, very simply that the thermal comfort zone that we're typically looking at for people is different between different individuals and different abilities. So when we're designing spaces, we don't actually want to automatically assume the thermal comfort for everyone is going to be between just above their head down to their stomach. That is not going to work for everyone. It's very, very different for people that might be categorised as being in the ambulant scenario, where they might not have any movement of their legs, but they have movement of their arms, but they can't actually reach a window to open it. So as designers, we need to bring some of those elements and really look at cross-ventilation, or using the HRV system, or having some level of automation within these learning spaces to actually allow these people to be included, which is very, very important. Another struggle that children have is when they get to a certain age, probably even around about the age of 5 or so, they want this independence. They want to be participating and have this sense of responsibility. And it's very difficult not to get them involved. So if you have a house that you have built quite thermally comfort, get them involved in actually opening and closing those windows and, lighting, maybe blinds or so forth. Get them understanding and being included in that information exchange that you're having within that space. And I guess this is, for myself personally, what I am wanting to see happen is that people are including the next generation into this learning about how spaces adapt, how they're environmentally responsive and predictive to peak times of the year and things like that, and get the children to actually understand the consequences within that space. And it's a great opportunity to do it between the pre-operational and the concrete operations development guidelines, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, because it allows them to jump into that next period of abstract thought with some anecdotal evidence, especially. Children also have a different need for sitting and standing, but what we can do in terms of designers for these spaces is look at typical comfort measures, which most of us do on a lot of buildings, but having your ESD consultants in there at the front end to actually analyse heating and cooling loads roughly for a certain space, so what the temperature is roughly going to do, if it's going to fluctuate or go up at a certain time. Acoustics is a big one. Airflow, if we know that in terms of cost and capital cost on a project, that we don't have as much money for the building, then we might include some education in terms of how to actually operate that house, depending on what the air tightness of this building is. Looking at comfort, so thinking outside the box, also include things like smell. So the indoor air quality of spaces like science and art rooms obviously need to be dealt with. If we're purely opening a window for it, we are also potentially undermining the performance of the building. So we need to look at really good extraction and introduction of fresh air. Humidity is a big one, and then also that can affect the longevity of the materials of the building. And if the building is deteriorating, and we have things like mould and that growing, then it can be an unhealthy environment. So inclusive environments and sitting still. So in terms of children and designers designing educational buildings, really need to get out of this mindset that children are sitting at desks in rows and so forth. In a lot of teaching methodology, we're actually getting teachers to bring students to them in little workshops, or you gain their attention somewhere for 3 minutes or so, which is probably the maximum concentration time that they have, also we're told. And then you bring them to another space. So as teachers, we need to be able to move around those spaces as well, and provide that little level of spontaneous excitement through something else in that space. Students don't sit still, so if you've got them for the 3 minutes of attention, then more likely after that, if you're not re-engaging them in another little comfortable space, then they're going to be doing this. They're going to be dancing all over the desks and cheering and challenging each other to keep their mind stimulated. The image on the right there is actually from a building that I'm going to show you in just a minute, which I connected with very personally because of this topic. As designers, we can actually also play with different focal planes so that we can actually create a longer depth of field for eyes, which is a really good exercise. So I've got 12 years as an optical dispenser to know that staring at a screen or looking at things up close for too long is not great for your eyes. Students need to be able to exercise their muscles back and forth between those spaces. So it is also very good to actually provide these learning spaces with that depth of field, with very balanced lighting and not harsh contrasting lighting, because otherwise the students will start squinting. The space might heat up too quickly or so forth, and that again disengages students. So providing spaces of comfort at different focal lengths using lighting can be done, such as these examples here. So you can shift materials or colours. Generally, when we are dealing with colours, we are looking at a lot of natural materials to provide that colour palette that we're after, rather than introducing too much paint and so forth that actually could potentially create more toxins within that environment. We're going as low or neutral VOC as possible. And slight temperature changes or daylighting, sound and proximity can actually also be used to bring people through spaces, which is really exciting when you're seeing it happen. So the example on the left, students being around this little workshop space also means that they can focus up close, they can remove themselves potentially from someone at a desk that is in another group away from them. So we can actually use maybe the floor materials or the wall materials to create a sense of isolation but proximity and closeness. In terms of child development, it's not until they get much older, around say the the concrete operations stage, so sort of between 3 and 7, where they are wanting to still be close to people like their parents or, their comfort zone, but just far enough to have that little bit of independence. The same sort of things happen in classrooms. The example on the right is actually a really good one, because you have that depth and that ability for some students to feel that sense of isolation and privacy, but still being connected. It's actually darker towards the front than it is at the back also, so maybe that also helps with the focal length. It's very balanced lighting. Instead of having harsh lighting, this has actually got something like a laser light on top, or obscured glazing, which if it's obscured glazing, then that might also mean that we can have a more insulated box there, and there's not much temperature difference. In terms of these spaces as well, temperature is something that does disconnect some kids from, say, parents. So I know from speaking to many people around me that are homeschooling children, that they're having troubles with the children continually coming in. So we can actually use things in the building sciences to actually engage those children and make them feel like they're not so isolated away from us. We can do that by using things like thermal comfort, so both spaces are fairly neutral. The whole building as a whole is nice and airtight, and therefore probably thermally comfortable at a very even range. We don't have really cold spots and really hot spots. So that can create a sense of connection. Materials and touch, so keeping the materials quite natural without harsh chemical smells. In terms of smells, we could also use the sentimental factor, so a lot of children still actually associate good things with, say, a perfume that their mother wears or something like that, or if there's continually flowers in next to the parents' desk that have a certain aroma, and then you replicate that elsewhere. Same kind of principles happen in school and learning spaces, so you might have a certain smell that's associated with a certain space, and that gives the children a sense of excitement. So again, it's touching on those senses and the development. Sound and acoustics, so by removing students too far, there's not enough reverberation and tapping from keyboards and things that parents or teachers might do. So children still need to have that sense that they can hear that there's this safety net nearby without being too amplified. In the case of my son with moderate hearing loss, once his hearing was restored, everything was too loud, so then we actually had to use dampening techniques to try to control that a little bit for him, which actually helped his concentration and made him a lot happier. And now he's at the stage where he can actually communicate if something is too noisy or not quite going well and he can't express it, then he'll actually try at least to use his words. So it gives them enough time to concentrate, to explain. Daylighting control is very important, not only in terms of being captured on thermal mass, but in terms, as I said, for the focal length within spaces, and also visually communicating people through spaces. So say if someone had hearing loss, they might be able to tell what direction movement should be happening through visual communication in terms of lighting through that space, through the gradients and the colours and so forth. In terms of daylighting control and thermal mass, we could also design spaces in front of a repetitive pattern of windows where you have a patch of thermal mass that is being heated. The children are learning about the sustainable properties of this and what is actually happening because they're engaged, they're sitting on this surface, and that way we can actually control temperature for different times of years and so forth. So it actually gets really interesting, and you can probably tell how passionate I am about playing with these different things in sustainable spaces, and how much I've learnt from my own experiences and in books like this, and speaking to mentor teachers, how these environments are actually affecting learning. Insulated spaces are great, especially for multilingual children. So they need spaces with acoustic or insulation treatments around the spaces, which is just a little bit better for concentration. Up until a certain point, children that are multilingual have a lot of trouble keeping up with mainstream because they're trying to bounce off these different ideas and trying to translate different languages into the same, symbolic meaning. But having too much distraction in terms of light or acoustic or temperature difference can actually really affect that learning as well. In terms of what I perceive as being the best approach, so having a very thermally stable classroom, say, or learning space, also means that it's got to be airtight so that we can control how much fluctuation there is in the temperature in that space. So if we're looking at the typical elevated classroom that I learnt in when I was little, it was timber on stud frame. The mornings it was very, very cold, and then it became a real hot box in the afternoon, and only started cooling down pretty much at the end of the day. That can also affect children as well, especially at the end of the day. Friday afternoon lessons are really hard if the classrooms are really hot and the children can't understand why that's happening, or they can't go and operate and be engaged and immersed in that spatial quality that is trying to be designed. So it's really important to actually have the air tightness and the fresh air and that thermally comfort zoned for that particular purpose. I don't know, maybe detention areas could be a little bit cooler, and then that might be a deterrent for some children. So we do look at sensory disruption as well in terms of learning when we're learning to be teachers. Can be caused by brain development and not knowing how to change the environment. So let's make these more inclusive, more engaging to students as well. Deficits in memory or recognition or how to operate the space. So it's not until this repetition happens where children actually immersed in it that they're going to recognise to do it themselves. Designers, as I said, aren't placing windows in areas that are actually able to be reached by a lot of people. So again, as designers, we have a responsibility to try to make every space as inclusive as we can. And we can use sustainable principles like cross ventilation and having certain windows lower than others to aid in the airflow as it heats up and is purged out of the building. We can use that to our advantage in design and really make these spaces a lot more inclusive. So too much light, sound, humidity or in still corners, not enough height as well to allow the passive performance of the building to work. So I know in the 10-star house we ended up having a raked ceiling, I think it's about 4.5 in the living area, which meant that we were actually able to use that volume to our advantage. We were able to start that convection process. So as designers, we need to look at some of those principles of creating, maybe roofs that tilt, that can actually aid in that airflow in those spaces. A lot of classrooms I've been in have a very structurally sort of simple flat roof, very low ceiling, and that's also not helping the environmental performance of that space, and therefore the children are disengaging. I also don't like treating acoustics just with band-aid remedies like sound check and so forth. I start looking at the planes within the materials and seeing how we can shift up those materials depending on if the teaching direction is straight ahead. Then I might make an acoustic panel in front of that, but then off to the side I can switch up and create a different sort of material finish that actually might dampen acoustics for group work or something like that. Mechanical HRV is very good for bringing in the fresh air supply, and also good in terms of us analysing the construction of the building. If it's very airtight or if there's certain you know, old construction built with new construction. We can look at whether there's going to be potential for mold growth and things like that. So making your design very adaptable to different scenarios as well, using that same methodology. So I've touched on this quickly, so I won't go into it again, but making sure that the proximity is looked at and using those sensors to actually create that sense of proximity instead of just distance as well. So I really encourage you to take a look at this book if you can, because it's really interesting in terms of those links in the child's brain as they're developing and when they actually get switched on. It's certainly an eye-opener for me, it's looking at this idea, as we were taught in architecture, about the hearth of the home, you know, this sense of warmth and proximity and connection. It's really good looking at the building design as a larger hearth, I guess. This thermally comfort zone where the students don't have to be all huddled together like penguins to keep warm. It makes it a much more engaging space, and then students don't feel like they're too close or too far away from other people because of that environment. Something you'll see on the following slide, I've just quickly put it up here though, is a sense of repetition, and you can use materials to do this, but also some surfaces are now using, especially acoustic surfaces, some using you know, dots and relief on that plane. We can also use the materials and their density and their properties in terms of how they are warmed or cooled naturally to create temperature differences that can bring people through spaces. Airflow can also be used. So if you imagine if you're going through a transitional space and you have cool air that's coming out at a certain point, that might indicate that it's you know, going into a bathroom or something like that. Warmer spaces might just very slightly change in temperature to create a sense that there is a classroom ahead at a certain point for someone that doesn't have vision. This is the example that I really encourage everyone to look up. I found it very fascinating. You might not be quite as passionate as me, but that's fine. This is a building in Scotland which I found really interesting when I was doing my studies. So it's a school for the blind, as it says there. So they very much use these fundamental techniques of using materials that adopt thermal principles very well, like thermal mass. Using the cork tiles not only acoustically but then thermally. It's been spoken about that they're at a very sort of neutral and stable temperature, so the children didn't feel like they were getting lost or outside of their safety zones because they couldn't visually see it. Predictive planning, so some of these environmental spaces within the building were actually basically designed to the same format. So looking at some sort of repetition or methodology for these projects is quite important. The environment where this was built, and it's not actually on the map there, but it was built next to like a factory or something that was very, very noisy. So something that they talk about for this particular building in terms of its design was the fact that using the sensors, because a lot of their students were blind or had dual sensory issues, was very important. They needed to make it as airtight as possible, but then introduce fresh air so that the indoor air quality was a lot higher, therefore aiding concentration as well. It's got a very thick wall and modified timber ventilation grills, which also meant that the temperature on the wall was stable and structurally quite durable, because we're still going through children that are learning to be rough and tumble and construct and so forth. And the sensory wall, which actually runs as a spline through the space, actually has some sort of relief. It's got a little bit of braille on there as well, I believe, but that actually allowed students to get through the space and you know, predict where they were going. There was some level of autonomy for them without giving them too much space to feel insecure. That's all on that one. So engagement. So as designers, generally what we're looking at is things like scales and envelope to make things continuous and fluid. Lighting, as I've said, to make things quite balanced as well, to get enough daylighting. So you can do daylighting studies on your designs. Safety and movement is something that we're always doing as designers. We read the code and we do what we're instructed, but I think that we really need to go that next step further as well. Culture and society. So the sense of culture that Alan Downton actually explains in one of his examples is actually amplified by this environmental approach to learning spaces. Because he says being blinded actually breaks down these racism barriers and so forth. By making an environment that's a little bit more engaging, so people aren't huddled in their little cliques and they can actually mingle and learn and they can hear what other people are saying, and they can make that choice to journey into that conversation. It's very important. So thank you. I hope that wasn't too much information. I'm obviously very passionate about this topic, but thank you for listening. I will have a look to see if there's any questions there as well on the chat. As I said, I'll leave this up while I'm just having a look through the questions, but you can get 1 Green Star Sustainable Development CPD point using these steps, and that applies to all our webinars. So follow the SUHO Australia YouTube channel for all our different webinars that we have on the different topics. So let me just check the chat just now. Yes, Vincent. So Vincent said about the automation of windows is a pet passion of mine. We need more of this in buildings in general. I absolutely agree, because we've done a lot of thinking around the 10-star house that we were doing, which is a lot of where this technology can actually, 10-star house technology can actually be put in education and so forth, aged care. There is a lot of discrimination from what I've read on buildings because they aren't automated enough, or they don't have the opportunity to be adapted to automation. So I think that's very important as well. I think it's the right approach if we're using some of these principles that we're getting on these buildings now, especially the 10-star house, to try to change the way designers think about spaces being for one individual. We've got to think about the whole life cycle. And I think it's also our responsibility in terms of addressing the design brief as well, to actually have a conversation with them about building this sustainable house is not just for the next 30 years. Think about it at a much grander scale. Are you going to have grandchildren in here in the future? How can we make a space adaptable, and how can we zone it from the beginning to keep technical spaces together and allow that sense of freedom that Australians love between the indoor and outdoor space? So it's very important as well. You can email us at that address as well if you have any other questions. But thank you very much for listening. Doesn't look like there's any more questions there for now, but thank you all for joining, and I will see you all in the future. Thanks.